I would take the president seriously on this tariff issue. There are carrots and sticks in life, but he is ultimately a free trader. He said that to me. He said it publicly. So he wants to solve this with the least amount of pain. Sometimes the path to this kind of growth is a little rocky. That's the way the world works.
But can you have growth if there's a trade war?
Hopefully we won't get to that point there.
The Trump administration is denying that the U.S. is in a trade war with China, but neither side appears to be backing down in this dispute, and it's escalating fast. It started with metals. Last month, U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum imports took effect. On the same day, China responds with tariffs on about $3 billion worth of American products. Then, last night, President Donald Trump unveiled a list of 1,300 Chinese products worth $50 billion, all facing new tariffs. Less than 24 hours later, stay with us, China announces it will retaliate with its own tariffs, also on about $50 billion of U.S. products. So, is a trade war looming? And if so, what does it mean for Canada? Joining me now in Montreal is Kevin Carmichael. He's a national business columnist for the Financial Post. Hi, Mr. Carmichael.
Hi, Betsy.
I want to start off just by reading you exactly what the president tweeted this morning. And I quote, "We are not in a trade war with China. That war was lost many years ago by the foolish or incompetent people who represented the U.S. Now we have a trade deficit of $500 billion a year with intellectual property theft of another $300 billion. Is he right?
Is he right? Is he right that we're not in a trade war?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll say yes, we're not in a trade war. I think most of the people that are closest to this situation are, or would describe this maybe as something more akin to professional wrestling at this point, where you have one of the scenarios where you have each pugilist sort of squaring off and hammering each other with equal blows, but perhaps this will disappear into ultimately nothing eventually. That's probably true. There's a lot at stake here. I don't think either of these two economies want to escalate this much farther. There's reason to worry, however. In China, you have a nationalist government that won't want to be seen to be backing down to the U.S., its great rival on the international scene. And then, of course, in the U.S., you have President Trump, who's being advised by a group of people who seem to see this as a civilizational battle between the U.S. and China, the sort of a fight for the future. And if that's the sort of idea or the narrative or scenario that takes hold in Washington, you could see how simple issues like avoiding a trade war that ultimately would tip the world into recession might not carry sway. But those are just reasons to worry. I think probably for the moment the safe bet is that calmer heads will prevail.
So if this isn't a trade war, what do you make of the comments that we heard from Trump's economic advisors today, including the one right before I introduced you, about the idea, basically insinuating this is a negotiation and let's hope everyone just backs down? Where is the truth? Is it kind of in between those two, or do you think that they're right?
Yeah, I think there's those advisors to Trump, they really want us to think that he's just a tactician, so don't worry about any of the rhetoric that comes out of the White House, that emanates from D.C. In any way, that they're just setting ourselves up to finally deal with some of these situations. I guess you can believe that. I worry, though, that rather than a war scenario, rather than sort of an attack scenario, what we actually see is a retreat. And what I mean by that, you may see China and international companies just tire of all of this. China doesn't need the U.S. economy like it did, say, a decade ago. It has a thriving economy of its own. Asia, in China's backyard, is thriving. There's a real possibility here that China could just say, okay, U.S., we'll match you tariff for tariff, but we're going to put our focus elsewhere. International companies will take their cue from that. I've already heard some anecdotes from various people saying, okay, look, I've decided what I'm going to do with my investment money. I'm going into China. I'm going into Asia. That's where the action is happening. And so you sort of see all that potential wealth creation, all that potential innovation start to go regional rather than global and sort of being shared by all of us. So, I mean, that, again, is maybe not the likely scenario, but it's something I worry about.
If this is just a negotiating tactic, what is the Americans' end goal? What are they hoping to win by using this tactic? Help us understand that.
Yeah. if you believe what Trump is telling us, I mean, all he cares about is the trade deficit. That's his marker. That's what he sees as a scorecard for whether U.S. is doing well or not so well. So if he managed to secure some policy changes that could at least allow him to go back to his base, back to the people that put him in office, so he could say, look, I've done some policy changes here that will narrow that trade deficit that I've been telling you for the last 2 or 3 years is a mark of weakness on the part of the U.S. He could portray that as a victory, and then we might all get out of this. So I think that's the tactical game here. The question is how much China is willing to play along.
We saw the stock markets take a hit earlier in the day, a big hit, but then rebound. What kind of impact could this dispute have for Canadians?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I think the immediate impact is probably a wash. Some people will say to themselves, yeah, look, if U.S. soybeans, for example, are suddenly more expensive in China, maybe that must be an opportunity for Canadian farmers, and that's true. Except the Canadian economy is so intertwined with the U.S. economy that essentially any opportunity that we might find abroad is going to be dented by a couple of things. One, that U.S. produce, goods, what have you, that might have been going into China is going to need somewhere else to go, so that could come into Canada, or that could go into places like Latin America or Europe or wherever else that Canada might be trying to do some business. And then Canadian companies tend to have operations or links to U.S. companies, so if the U.S. isn't doing well or suddenly gets tripped up, then that's going to blow back on Canada as well. But I do think there's a longer-term opportunity here, and so let's think about that Canadian soybean farmer who says, okay, suddenly I have an opportunity in China that I didn't have before. He or she can move in there, get a toehold in China, which is within a period of time, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, is going to be the world's major economy. Suddenly that Canadian farmer has a foothold in a very good market, in frankly in the part of the world where all the action is right now. So that could be a benefit. So if I'm a Canadian business person, I'm looking for opportunities like that, and certainly if I'm a Canadian trade diplomat, I'm looking to see how I can take advantage of this situation to perhaps create a path into China, into Asia for Canadian business.
I want to ask you about another potential impact for Canada, and that's on NAFTA. There seems to be almost a renewed extra enthusiasm for the possibility of a deal being reached against the backdrop of this so-called, maybe apparent, whatever it is, trade war. We know Chrystia Freeland said today that she'll meet with Robert Lighthizer tomorrow, and she hopes talks are at a, quote, decisive moment. Should we expect any news to come out of that meeting?
I don't know if we can expect some news. I mean, I guess so. I think we'll be looking for some signals. The signals around NAFTA over the last number of weeks have been positive. You've seen a marked change in rhetoric from the U.S. side. They clearly have reached a point where they want to get a deal for whatever reason. Canadians and Mexicans were maybe a little bit amused at first at the sight of the rhetoric from the U.S. changing so quickly. They were a little reluctant at first, I think, to maybe believe what they were hearing. But you've seen the Canadian and Mexican rhetoric also start to, in recent days, match that of the U.S. So whether there be an announcement of a preliminary deal or a promise of a preliminary deal, that might not happen this quickly, but certainly it would be important to keep an eye out for more signals that the relations between these three parties are warming up.
How much do you think those positive signals has to do with what's happening with China?
I think there's probably a significant role there. There's only so much the U.S. Trade Representative can do at one time. Clearly, the White House has decided to aim its guns. I'm sorry to bring in a war metaphor to this conversation, but it clearly has decided to focus on China at this time. So there's probably a couple of things going on. I don't think you want to be trying to negotiate with so many different players all at the same time. There's probably pressure from Congress and the U.S. business community to say, look, if you are actually going to go after China in this way, then at least try to calm things down here in North America. That's probably happening. And it just could be a manpower issue. There's so many resources right now committed to the NAFTA negotiations that the USTR might just not have the resources it needs to really focus on China.
Okay, thanks for your time, Mr. Carmichael.
My pleasure.